Fireside Tech Talks of the Blaze. Today we're going to be looking at Apple's recent announcement where they're going to be migrating the Mac to ARM-based CPUs, and looking at that in light of when Microsoft attempted to create an ARM-based platform for Windows, and comparing and contrasting those two. But first, let's look at what's new on Azure. It's been a quiet week on Azure again. There's a lot of small announcements related to particular features on the several products on Azure, and it would take me a long time to go through all of those, but a few of them that I did find interesting were related to some things related to ingress into Azure on Azure Front Door and on Azure Content Delivery Network. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Azure Front Door, what it allows you to do is have a single point of entry for all of Azure. So it's a global resource where you can have a single point of entry for traffic into your Azure ecosystem, and then it will have routing rules internal to the Azure Front Door system that will then spread that traffic across an entire global infrastructure if you're in multiple regions in Azure. And on top of that, they gave the ability to have rules in the engine that Azure Front Door employs for routing that traffic, as well as some additional types of security enhancements related to WAF type capabilities, such as protection from cross-scripting attacks for things like CORS attacks, like access control headers and things like that are available through the Azure Front Door. And the same rules engine that Azure Front Door uses also is used by Azure Content Delivery Network. Azure CDN is a feature that allows you to have a content delivery network on the Azure infrastructure, allows you to take static content such as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and images and put those closer to the end user, whoever is going to be consuming a website. And that way they're able to consume that data in a place that is much geographically closer, so their latency is less than what if they had to go around the world or through multiple different kinds of networks to get that kind of content. And the same rules have been adapted for Azure Content Delivery Network. So Azure Front Door is kind of a mashup of two products on Azure. It was Traffic Manager, and then Azure Content Delivery Network, as well as a few other things that are included in there, like application gateways and other things to provide WAF. And having these rules available gives some level of security and the ability to control that traffic a little bit better within the context of Azure Front Door. Now, another cool feature that I launched on Azure Pipelines is the ability to use Linux ARM. And Azure Pipelines is a feature that allows you to build out different kinds of pipelines for hosted builds on Azure within the context of Azure DevOps. And what this gives you the ability to do is build software in the native environment which it would be running. So if you're writing ARM-based applications, it now supports ARM64. So ARM is a popular platform, as we mentioned, for different kinds of workloads. Like, and again, Macintosh is moving to ARM, but it's also used in a number of Linux contexts as well for embedded Linux systems. And that would mean that building software on an ARM CPU for those kinds of systems would be useful inside of Azure DevOps. It already supports Mac and Linux and Windows, so adding in the ARM-based feature will give you the ability to support Linux-based builds on ARM CPUs. So that means that you can now build software for embedded systems on Linux using Azure DevOps without having to have a hosted, self-hosted agent that can do those kinds of builds for you. So that's all the announcements I'm really going to talk about this week. Let's move on to our main story, where we're going to be looking at Apple's announcement for Mac and moving that to ARM processors. So for our main story today, I'm going to look at an announcement that Apple made this week concerning the Macintosh and how they're going to be transitioning the Macintosh to an ARM-based CPU. And I don't usually look at Apple. I'm mostly concerned with the Microsoft ecosystem, but I wanted to look at this through the lens of Microsoft, because Microsoft did attempt to do something like this in the past. And I want to use Microsoft's attempt as a baseline to answer the question, is Apple killing the Mac by transitioning to ARM? And I want to compare and contrast Microsoft's past attempt with Windows RT with the future attempt with the Macintosh going to ARM-based CPUs. So First off, let's do a little bit of history about behind Windows RT and what Microsoft attempted to do there. So, right around the launch of the iPad, Microsoft attempted to launch their first device that was branded under the Surface moniker, and they had on that an operating system that was based on Windows 8. And this ARM-based operating system used the ARM-based CPUs on the hardware, and it created a new platform called Windows UWP, which was intended to create a new kind of application for Windows that was targeted at the mobile platform that was Windows RT running on their mobile hardware, as well as the desktop ecosystem, which was the laptops and desktop environments that they were creating at the time as well. Now, Windows RT could run those UWP applications, and then you could deploy them to the mobile platform as well as desktops and laptops as well with a single code base. And the Windows RT allowed users to download applications through the Windows Store, which would allow those applications to run on the device. The problem with the Windows RT is that it was a brand new platform from Microsoft that was intended for mobility, but it didn't have backwards compatibility with existing Windows applications. And so while the new applications were created, what ended up happening with the Windows RT is it just didn't get enough traction for the product to really take off. And within a couple of generations after its original launch, the product was more or less dead. And Microsoft has not made an attempt to revive a ARM-based platform for running Windows since that time. However, they continue to develop a touch-based IO x86 Windows experience that you can get through touchscreen laptops or tablet-based devices that run x86 hardware, but it's not running an ARM-based CPU like the original Surface tablets did. And the ability to run x86 Windows on the new Surface hardware is still a full Windows operating system that is backwards compatible with old Win32 applications running in an x86 platform, as well as the ability to run UWP apps. And Microsoft has made an announcement in at Build this year to bring together the UWP platform as well as the old Win32 platform in a project called Project Reunion, which will allow these two disparate ecosystems for developing applications to come under one roof, and then be able to write applications that are more or less portable between the platforms without having to have two different SDKs or two different kinds of applications that are being deployed through that particular project. Now, with the RT, what Microsoft did, I think that ultimately resulted in the demise of the product, was lack of backwards compatibility and trying to create a new ecosystem. And this within the Windows ecosystem really created a product that just wasn't primed for a legacy of backwards compatibility that folks had gotten used to for Windows that went back to the original days of Microsoft operating systems that were running on DOS that had just been perpetually brought along, providing great deal of backwards compatibility with every new iteration of Windows and DOS that came after the original launch. And the Windows RT didn't have that, so Windows folks were like, I can't bring my old apps to this platform. I have to stick with my new apps only, and that ultimately just didn't sell well and sit well with Windows users. So is Apple going to repeat this history with the Windows with the new ARM CPUs for the Macintosh platform? Are they going to commit the same problem that Windows RT has? And there are a couple of arguments that you could make to this and say yes, and there are some that will say no, they aren't going to repeat history and do what Windows RT did. So if I was to answer, is Macintosh killing the Mac by going to ARM? Yes. There's a few arguments I think that you can make to this that would ultimately result in them killing off the Macintosh by doing this move. And it starts with a look at Mac's market share concerning how much do of the PC industry do they actually own. Now, when I say PC industry, I'm excluding things like tablets and phones from this. I'm looking exclusively at the PC industry, which would include tablets and desktops and workstations and the all-in-ones like and anything basically running the Mac OS and its direct competitors, which would be most versions of Linux that are distributed that you can install on generic hardware, as well as Chrome OS that runs on Chromebooks. So as of the recording of this video, Macintosh has about 9.5% of the market share, and the remaining 91% or so, or 90.5% is divided up among Windows, which has about 87%, and the remaining 3.5% is composed of Linux and Chrome OS. And at this point, Mac is still a significant operating system, but it's not one that if one was to lose, one would not lose a significant amount of market share if one is targeting multiple platforms. That is, I'm writing an app that's targeting Mac OS, Windows, and say Linux. If I was to lose Macintosh, I might lose about 9 to 10% of my user base, which if the Macintosh was to die off, and that could be a consideration for folks that are thinking about writing software for Mac. Second, a Mac is only about 9.5% of Apple's total business as well. And by Apple's total business, we're talking about everything that Apple does. And currently, the lion's share of their business comes from their mobile platforms. And that would include the watch, the iPad, and the iPhone, and the iPod, Touch that runs iOS. And of that, over 50% of Apple's business comes from iPhone sales. So it's the cash cow at Apple. The other 40% of the Apple ecosystem is composed of iPad sales, as well as services related to Apple's business, such as iTunes, downloading music, shows, and movies, and things like that come with the services that Apple sells that you can get access to on all their devices. And so they have a lot of revenue from that, which actually is more revenue than they get from the Macintosh platform as well. So all that to say is Mac is not a major part of Apple's business, although it is a significant part of it. It's not the cash cow, or nor does it derive most of their business. So considering that Mac is a small player in the total PC market and it's only a small player in Apple's business, killing the Mac, it wouldn't be a huge dent in either one of these. It would certainly be problematic for Apple users, but as the industry is concerned, or as Apple's business is concerned, changing the Mac, it's not such a big deal that it would kill the Mac. Killing the Mac would make a big difference one way or another. So by going to ARM, one could argue that, okay, somebody's just holding on to Macintosh, and it would be a painless transition to go to something else. So even so, it would not be a big deal. So considering that transitioning to a new platform, especially when you're talking about recompiling code for a completely different CPU architecture, means that many of those who are going to be looking at these numbers might not choose to do that. One would be game developers. Game developers might look at that and go, no, it's just not going to work. I don't see a transition. I don't see a path forward for running games on Macintoshes. And that might not be a problem for many gamers, because you can run games on Macs, but most gamers aren't traditionally gaming on Macs. They're generally going to be gaming on Windows with a niche community in Linux. But by and large, gamers don't use Macs. They use Windows for PC games, or they use consoles. But mobile gaming, of course, for phones, but not for a desktop. So they might alienate the gaming community by doing that. Secondly, it wouldn't impact the gaming community by doing that as well. So I could see a lot of game developers not choosing to write for Mac anymore, and not that that's going to impact Macintosh at all. Maybe Mac doesn't care, and it wouldn't impact them as well. But the outside of gaming, it's a unanswered question in my mind about developers who are writing cross-platform applications and cross-platform tools, and they see this transition going on in the Mac ecosystem, and the question that crosses their minds is it worth porting my application to an ARM CPU, depending on the amount of work that's needed for that, to gain that small market share that is offered through the Macintosh platform. And there are a lot of tools that developers use to do development on Macintoshes. And some have adopted the Mac as their development platform of choice. And you can run a lot of cool tools on the Mac, and largely because it supports x86. The cross-platform tools are available. You can run many IDEs on Mac for developing some things like Java, or you can write console applications, cross-platform applications on the Macintosh. But should they transition to ARM-based CPUs, all of these dev tools might not come along with it, and ultimately that could spell a disaster for folks that are using Macs for development. Also, when is developing software on other platforms that are targeting the Macintosh, should the SDKs not be available on that ARM CPU, it could mean that the Mac platform gets developed by a number of application developers that are writing cross-platform apps as well. And so there are two ways to answer that that Apple might produce. One they're very likely to do is is to provide a backwards compatibility at the hardware layer that allows these older applications that were written for Macintosh to continue to operate on the ARM CPU, even though they were targeting the x86 platform. And this is what Apple did when they transitioned off of the Motorola chips onto x86, is they provided a compatibility layer that allowed the old PowerPC apps to continue to run on x86 hardware through that compatibility layer. And it was basically emulating the system calls at the hardware level that allowed those to be translated into x86 system calls that allowed the application to run. And that was the answer that they gave, and it worked for Apple. If they do a similar thing for ARM to x86, then they will be able to provide some backwards compatibility with those applications. The difficulty, though, with that is ARM is a reduced instruction set, so the complexity of writing a backwards compatibility layer from ARM to x86 requires a lot more work than the other way around, because the instruction set is significantly less than what you would get with the x86 CPUs. And so that could be a problem for businesses that are looking to support Macintoshes without the compatibility layer at the hardware layer. Then that might require some significant code changes, and those code changes might translate into, hey, we're just not going to use Macs anymore. We're not going to support it. That it remains to be seen if they actually produce a compatibility layer at the hardware layer. Now, I imagine Apple will provide a compatibility layer for their first-party development suites, such as Xcode and Swift. Anything you write in Xcode and Objective C, anything you write in Xcode pretty much will probably be able to compile for x86 and ARM on the Macintosh. But it's those third-party tools that, unless they provide those SDKs for the ARM CPU, transitioning to other platforms just to capture that 9% of the market might not be something that somebody wants to invest a lot of time and effort into. And another kind of niche market that they'll end up probably losing would be the ability to run virtual machines on the Mac platform as well. Say a big part of my development experience is running virtual machines on Windows. I run a lot of Linux virtual machines and Windows virtual machines, and that's because I do a lot of cross-platform development for Linux and Windows that is primarily targeted at Azure. But at the same time, Apple allows you to run Windows and Linux virtual machines, and by transitioning to ARM, having without that a virtualized CPU, that's really going to be a bad experience on the Macintosh platform, because a lot of the acceleration that VMs are provided is done at the CPU level. And it would require an entire emulation layer on top of an ARM CPU, which would mean that VMs would be doggedly slow on the ARM platform should they abandon the x86 platform. Lots of possibilities here. It's to be determined if that any of these actually come to fruition. But without that backwards compatibility, I could see a lot of folks saying, no, I'm not going to go to the Macintosh. And that could result in the ultimate demise of the Macintosh. If those compatibilities and transitional type platforms aren't available to the Macintosh. And considering it's a small market share, many may not say, hey, it's not worth it. And they don't follow through, and they just abandon that platform and focus on the lion's share, which would be x86 based hardware running Linux and Windows moving forward. Now, on the flip side of that same coin, one might say, no, that the transition to ARM will not kill the Macintosh. In fact, it might actually cause it to blossom even more. And I think there's some good arguments here that could be made. And if one wants to answer this as no, it's not going to kill it, and they might offer these arguments as a reason for this. And one argument that is in favor of this, no, it's not going to kill off the Mac. In fact, it might cause it to blossom, is that Apple is already working with vendors like Microsoft and Adobe to ensure that their software works on this new ARM CPU. And so Microsoft provides, productivity software such as Office for Macintosh. And it is widely used by Mac users, and as well as Adobe. Adobe has been one of the mainstays in the Macintosh for decades now, and Microsoft's Adobe's partnership with Apple has always been very tight, and it's one of the things that has kept the Macintosh platform around because Adobe did provide software for it, and the user experience that people came to appreciate from Adobe on the Macintosh was tightly coupled with Adobe, Apple, and the hardware that they offered. So that relationship will likely continue. And the fact that Microsoft and Apple are less antagonistic to one another these days, it makes sense that they're working with one another to produce that software from the productivity side, from the Microsoft side as well. So given that these two large vendors are producing software already for the ARM-based Macs, it makes sense that the folks that are using the Adobe software and the Microsoft software will be able to transition to that new platform with relative ease, although some of the more niche cases might not be might not be able to do that. Moreover, it's likely that there will be some kind of compatibility layer that they provide for the Apple platform, like they did with the PowerPC. This is one thing that Microsoft did not do with the RT. They have no backwards compatibility, while Apple might provide some kind of backwards compatibility either through the first-party tools, like I mentioned, being able to cross-compile for the ARM and for the x86 for Xcode, Swift, and so on, or providing some kind of compatibility layer for x86 for their ARM CPU to allow all applications to continue to run on the Macintosh for the foreseeable future. And which of those they do, I'm more likely to bet that they do it for Xcode and Swift and other languages that are written in Xcode, while the x86 emulation layer might not come to fruition because that's very difficult to do. It might be possible, but I wouldn't bet the farm on that one. And lastly, one might argue that by transitioning the Mac to the ARM CPUs, that they're bringing the Macintosh platform more closely aligned to the existing Apple ecosystem that drives iOS, iPad, the watch, and the TV ecosystem, which are already running ARM CPUs. So one can imagine that Macintosh becomes just another option in this already mature ecosystem that has tons of apps already available. And so what ends up happening is one has the ability to write one more or less one application that targets iPad, iOS, and the Mac OS without having to create a separate app that is more for the Macintosh and one for the iOS platform. Rather, it brings it under the same ecosystem so that the Macintosh is treated more like a sister platform to iOS rather than a completely disparate platform. And having that convergence with iOS means that you have a very mature app ecosystem that allows those to run more natively on the Mac platform as well. So this will kind of bring those two together, and now you have an existing a whole lot of apps that can be brought to the Macintosh, and then it makes the transition to ARM much easier because now you have apps. While you might be abandoning other apps, you now have a lot of new apps that can run on it as well, which many people are already comfortable using from iPad or iOS. So the arguments that are made in favor of not killing the Mac, I think, are actually better than the ones that might result in the demise of the Mac. And having transitioned in the past, Apple's got some experience with this. They also have a lot of momentum going forward with working with vendors already, and also the iOS, iPad, iWatch, TV ecosystem kind of being brought more closely aligned to the Macintosh as well. I think actually what's going to happen with the Mac OS is that we'll see a evolution of the Macintosh as another offering in the Apple ecosystem that will give it a lot more access to applications that it didn't already have access to through the iOS ecosystem, as well as the existing apps that are out there as well. And it will allow it to blossom in that respect. And so it will still be a walled garden approach like you see with iPad and iOS, but it'd be a better approach from the perspective of Apple, in that it will give the Macintosh platform something that is very closely related to what most people go to Apple for already, which is apps on the iPad and iOS. So what does this say for the takeaways? The takeaway is that providing backwards compatibility for existing ecosystems is important whenever you introduce a disruptive technology into an ecosystem. That's where I believe the RT failed, but the transition from the Motorola platform onto the Intel platform, and what it didn't for the Macintosh. And so by doing a lot of these kinds of backwards compatibilities or opening up into mature ecosystems on the Macintosh, I think will ultimately keep the Macintosh alive rather than killing it off by doing this transition. So I don't think there's a lot of risk involved. In fact, I think it's a wise thing that what Apple is doing to bring some convergence between the Mac platform and the iOS platform. So all I have to say is backwards compatibility is important for applications, especially if you're introducing disruptive technologies into those platforms. So thanks for listening to this edition of Fireside Tech Talks with Blaze. We'll be looking at more relationships between Apple and Microsoft in the future, I'm sure. Like I've mentioned, I really want to do a piece on the personal relationship between Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and want to look at that, as well as doing a similar look at IBM's relationship to Microsoft as well. So look forward to these episodes on Fireside Tech Talks with Blaze.